They founded DJ Case and Associates in 1986 based on the premise that the art and science of communication and other social science disciplines are critically important to the science of natural resource conservation and protection. Since then, he's worked with almost every state and federal agency in the nation, every state and federal natural resource agency in the US, and many major state and national natural resource organizations. His early work as a biologist and then media personality opened his eyes to the importance of social science disciplines to accomplishing conservation goals. Okay, now you have the floor, Dave.
Thanks, Kaylin. It's a pleasure to I don't know if I say to be here or to be there. I guess I'm in both places. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I also want to point out that Dr. Daniel Escher, you see his name up there on the screen. He's also calling in remotely from Seattle. He heads up our Western office and was responsible for much of what you're gonna see here today. We all know that profound changes are occurring in the American public's connection to nature, the outdoors and wildlife. At the same time, there's a growing body of evidence that contact with nature is not just a recreational amenity, but is fundamental to health and well-being. In 2011, DJK staff gathered with Dr. Kellert, who, as many of you know, is Professor Emeritus at Yale, at our office to explore how to better understand and foster Americans' relationship with nature. Dr. Kellert has been a leader. I would offer the leader in researching and articulating the importance of contact with nature to human health and well-being. But the result, as Kaylin mentioned, of that meeting in 2011 was the Nature of Americans, a national initiative to understand and connect Americans with nature. And it's what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. Sadly, Dr. Kellert passed away in the fall of 2016, actually on November 27th, so just a year and a couple days ago. It's been a real honor for the social scientists and other staff here at DJ Case to work alongside Dr. Kellert, and it's a real privilege to be able to share some of the results and actually some of the things that have happened since the results formally came out. Of course, you shouldn't get very far into your presentation without acknowledging the people that made it all possible. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the partners in this initiative. Special thanks in particular go to Carter Smith, who's the director in Texas, Nick Wiley, who's the director in Florida, former U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director Dan Ash, and Kim Sams and Beth Stevens at Disney for their very early and ardent support to make this all possible. Kaylin mentioned an overview of the methodology, just to briefly describe it. The understanding part of the initiative included 3 major research efforts, and these were conducted in 2015 and 2016. Focus groups across the country with a wide spectrum of adult Americans, a representative online survey of over 10,000 adult Americans, interviews with 771 8 to 12-year-old children, and these were conducted webcam to webcam. And for each of those children, we also had an online survey of one of their parents. And in most cases, 90% of the cases, it was the mother. We have a whole bunch of data. We like to refer to it as a mountain, not just a mountain of data, but a mountain range of data, results, findings, and recommendations. We formally released the report on April 26th. We're doing additional analysis, and actually you'll see some of that analysis that aren't in the reports today. But you can find the details at natureofamerican.org, and I'll have that pop that up on the screen here. But what I want to talk about this afternoon is first talk about Americans' disconnection. Second, contrast that to the interest in nature. And finally, share 5 recommendations for the conservation community, kind of in a large scale. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time right at the end talking about translating this to some of the on-the-ground work that's happening right now that actually Kaylin referred to. So many of you, I know, have heard of biophilia. It's that inherent inclination to affiliate with nature. With Dr. E.O. Wilson at Harvard, Steve Kellert pushed forward the idea that that connecting with nature is fundamental to human health and well-being. Because that trait is so fundamental to how we as humans operate, Kellert was not surprised and hasn't been surprised over the last few years to see this growing body of empirical evidence, things like that adults and children can concentrate better in outdoor settings, that people feel happier and less anxious when they're in forests, that areas with trees promote pro-social behavior, that contact with animals helps children to develop nurturing relationships more generally, that workers in offices and with plants and fractals are more productive. And that list kind of goes on and on. Lots of, even since we started in 2011, lots of published literature validating the idea that contact with nature has a real positive impact on health and well-being. And that biophilia is expressed in lots of different dimensions. And I won't go spend much time talking about these different dimensions, but just know that as we designed all of the studies and inquired of people, that we were thinking of this multidimensional kind of aspect, and that it's not just a recreational activity, but how we interact with nature affects us in lots of different ways. And we'll come back to that in general, though I won't talk specifically about the biophilic elements a lot. And just mention that there is a national report. There's also a Florida report and a Texas report. We did separate samples for Florida and Texas. What I'll report on today is all national level, the 5,500 national sample, and the children. The 8 to 12-year-old children, we conducted 771 interviews, as I mentioned, and those were done in 5 states, the 5 largest states: California, Illinois, New York, Florida, and Texas. So there's 8 major insights and 22 recommendations. Chapter 5 of the national report kind of summarizes all of that. And again, I'm just going to touch on some key factors here. I really don't need to describe the things that disconnect Americans from nature in daily life. You see them every day in your families, in your work, and obviously in the work that you do and in your lives. But let me start by describing 3 reasons for disconnection that the American public shared with us. The first source of disconnection is competing priorities. Americans face competing priorities for their time, their attention, and their money. They have children, long commutes, and exhausting jobs. The mother of a young child told us, and you see it here on the screen, work and home, go put the kids to bed. That's pretty much all we have time for. But she wasn't alone. Almost half of the adults we surveyed across the U.S. agreed with the statement, there are more important issues in my life than my concern for nature. One of the effects of competing priorities is that Americans spend relatively little time outside in nature. Over half said they spend less than 5 hours a week outside. And this is self-reported, as you know, all of the work I'm reporting on here are how people answered questions or reported. It's not an actual measurement of their time. We ask them, in this case, in a typical week when weather allows, about how many hours do you spend outside in nature? And this is the answer. So again, over 50% spend 5 hours or less. 25%, a full quarter, spend just less than 2 hours per week. So most Americans are spending their time indoors. From our study, we heard about a second reason for this disconnection from nature. Among adult Americans, a shared expectation of what good connection to nature looks like have changed. The older adults observed how it used to be normal to spend time exploring and playing and discovering outdoors. Now they worry because it's not the same for their children and grandchildren. And this is a theme that we heard over and over. It was really interesting in the focus groups and in the open-ended questions with the adult survey. There's this genuine concern that younger generations are growing up without the same nature experiences that were so positive and important to adults. If the shared expectation used to be that kids spent most of their time playing outdoors, that is no longer the case. We ask parents, in a typical week, how much time does your child spend on the following activities? There was a long list of activities, and they're grouped here and reported by age. So you can see that the age 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 across the bottom of each of these groups of bar graphs. As you can see on the left side, time on computers and TV towers over time spent outdoors, and this increases with age from 8 to 12, while time spent outdoors decreases as children get older. Here's a second example of shifting expectations. Most adults in our studies reported spending relatively little time outside in nature, as we saw in that bar graph, and most were satisfied with the little time they did spend in nature. Of the group who spent 2 hours, so this is a graph of the people who spent 2 hours or less per week outdoors, nearly half of those are satisfied with that amount of time. So 47% are satisfied with that, what we would all agree is a very small amount of time each week outdoors. So it's becoming normal then in American society to spend relatively little time outdoors. So you can't rely on this sense of shared expectations or general social norms to get people outdoors. We're going to have to be more explicit, and that's a big deal. I'll come back to this, the importance of shared expectations a little bit later when I talk about the expectations Americans have in terms of authentic nature. It's located in faraway places and requires a great effort to reach. We'll come back to that. I've talked about competing priorities and shared expectations. A third reason for disconnection is the physical places where Americans live. Americans live in physical spaces that discourage contact with nature, the natural world, and even representations of it. So obviously, we're becoming more and more urbanized. They mentioned concrete jungles, jungle of cities, housing developments, and only low-quality parks nearby. Perhaps it's not a surprise then that so many adults say their pastimes, hobbies, and interests are more indoors-oriented. 40%, when you give them the option of outdoors-oriented, indoors-oriented, or about the same. 40%, one quarter, or 40% say they're more indoors-oriented, and only about a quarter say they're more outdoors-oriented. As I've described, Americans encounter a number of forces that disconnect them from nature. These are society-wide issues. They're massive, and they'll require all sorts of organizations, those of us on the call, and lots of others, to work together to try and solve or try to address. But it doesn't mean that the situation is hopeless. What I want to show now is the potential, from what we think the potential for Americans to connect with nature. American adults are interested in nature. We ask, how do your interest in nature compare with your other interests? A quarter of adults say their interest in nature are their most enjoyable. Another half say it is among their more enjoyable interests. When we ask children, do you agree? Our children also enjoy nature in a number of different ways. They think insects are interesting. They enjoy activities like climbing trees and camping. And my favorite, 70% of the children said they would rather explore woods and trees than play on neat-looking grass. So encouraging results, not necessarily what we would have expected. In fact, nature for children is fun. They use that word to describe it. When asked, do you have more fun playing indoors or outdoors, only 10% say they have more fun playing indoors. So, the term we've thrown around some is that we don't necessarily have a child problem. We have a parent's problem or an adult problem. 40% of the adults said they're more indoors oriented, but only 10% of children say they have more fun playing indoors, and 42% say more fun playing outdoors. Alongside interest and enjoyment of nature, Americans also recognize nature's benefit to their health and well-being. 3 out of 4 adults say getting into nature is very or extremely important for their physical health. So if you ask the same question for emotional outlook, what would it be? Even stronger. When asked about their emotional outlook, 3 out of 4 said getting into nature is very or extremely important. Adults are not the only ones who recognize the benefits of nature. Children recognize that nature helps them to grow healthy, to be happy, to enjoy family and friends, and to know that they're important and liked. Adults see the benefits of nature not only for health and well-being, but also intellectual development. I think this, was one of the more fascinating questions that we ask. Despite the emphasis on core subjects in schools, the overwhelming majority agree that understanding how nature works is as important to a child's education as reading, writing, and math. It's important to point out that the last several slides we just reviewed are are patterns that really hold up against across demographics. So across age groups, residential location, race and ethnicity, gender, and income, you don't see much variation in any of the slides that I just used since we started talking about the fact that there's hope, that those are very similar across those demographics. So I've talked about enjoyment of nature and recognition of nature's benefits. Let's add what I think is one more reason for optimism: support for nature programming and funding. Perhaps for many of us a really important issue. We ask a number of questions related to this. This is just one. Are programs for Americans to enjoy nature and wildlife underfunded, adequately funded, or overfunded? Half of adults say that programs for Americans to enjoy nature and wildlife are underfunded, and only 3% say that they're overfunded. Interestingly, if you look a little bit at just a little bit of preview of what some of the stuff we'll talk about in a minute, but if the highest levels of support were found among, if we look a little deeper at demographics, among Hispanics, younger adults, higher income adults, and urban residents. And this last one is the dissatisfaction with community equals higher support. And what that means is that we ask a number of questions related to people's satisfaction with their community and where they lived and some aspects of that. And that as dissatisfaction with community decreased, you had higher support for nature-related programming and funding. So as I mentioned, there is hope. American adults and children are interested in nature. They recognize nature's benefits to them, and they support nature-related programming and funding and support conservation. Yet these massive kind of society-wide barriers still exist. Competing priorities, shared expectations, changing shared expectations in physical places, and unfortunately many other aspects that I'm not going into right at this time. So what do we as a conservation community try to do to overcome this difference between an interest but moving people to action? And I'm going to share 5 recommendations. As I mentioned, there are 22 specific recommendations in chapter 5 of the report. I would kind of boil down those down to 5, and I want to step through each of those and then open it up for questions. Number 1 is to redefine connecting with nature. When many of you here in this room or online on this call think of connecting with nature, you think of something like this: alone, immersed in a remote setting. Or something like this: or this, a once-in-a-lifetime trip to an iconic place, in this case, the Grand Canyon. And no surprise, adults in our research have bought into these expectations about what true or pure experiences in nature require. As one respondent said, nature in the Grand Canyon, nature at its best. Yet what our research shows is that the majority of Americans cannot experience nature in this way. They don't have the time or money to do it. Or if they do have the time or money, they may not be able to do it only once a year or kind of once in a lifetime. So if we continue to convince people that nature is something they can only experience at distant refuge or distant park or natural area, then we're going to miss the opportunity to experience nature's benefits on a routine basis and a day-to-day basis, and also a large proportion of the population we're going to also miss. And in addition, our results show that children consistently place nature as local, as out the back door. For children, you don't need to load them in the car yet again to give them times in the outdoors that they will never forget, or a special place to remember. And those were 2 of the questions that we asked them. So connection to nature has to be redefined to include routine action, not just one-off events. It has to be expanded to include recreational activities that are not just nature-focused, but in other words, people can engage with nature, enjoy nature, connect with nature as part of their other activities in their daily or weekly lives. And I think the difference between how adults view nature and its remoteness as being authentic versus children who view it out in the back door. Dr. Jessica Michaels Carrasco, that you saw on that first slide, is a social scientist with us. And we, when we conducted those online interviews, those webcam to webcam interviews, we wanted to get some video of the actual interview process. But of course, we couldn't take video of our respondents for confidentiality reasons. So Jessica brought her 10-year-old daughter into the office, and we set up in our kitchen. We set up an interview with the actual interviewers and went through the process and videotaped it. And at one point, one of the questions is there a time in the outdoors that you'll never forget? And Jessica was sitting next to her daughter, like some of the parents did. Not all the parents stayed there. They'd let their child just answer the questions by themselves. But like some of the parents, Jessica was sitting there, and she, as that question was asked by the interviewer, she said, I'm racing through my mind of all the neat things we've done locally in northern Indiana, but also her husband is from Florida, so they've taken the kids to Florida and gone to the Everglades and all these kind of iconic wildlife viewing nature experiences. Seeing a bald eagle nest, all these different experiences. And so she's running through her mind which of these that she's going to pick when she answers the question, is there a time in the outdoors you'll never forget? And she said what Desi, her daughter, said was, well, it was a time when my brother and my friend went outside and built a little city with sticks and leaves, and then described it in great detail. And as soon as she started talking about it, Jessica recognized the time. That, you know, she remembers distinctly the time that they had this activity. But it was, even though she'd had all these kind of far away, iconic, what we might think of as iconic or pure nature engagement experiences, what she thought of was going in the backyard. So the second recommendation is to be social. And here I don't mean social media, though that's important for other reasons. But connection to nature needs to have a social aspect. Nature experienced alone in solitude can be a powerful thing, but that's really the exception. It's not the primary way that adults and children experience nature. Americans are clear. I mean, when they talk about their most memorable moments and their special places outdoors, they nearly always involve other people when they describe them. Americans make time for nature when they have social support to do so, and when those activities involve their friends and family. To reinforce that point, 51% of adults indicated they do not like being in nature by themselves. When asked, I don't like being in nature by myself, 51% agreed or were neutral in relation to that question. And that for urban residents, young and middle-aged adults, and non-whites, the very audiences you're wanting to reach, those percentages get even higher. Being social means supporting mentorships of all types, inviting pre-existing social groups to programs, and lots of other applications of this. So the recommendations, number one is redefine connecting with nature. Number two is to be social. And third, consider similarities and differences. And I'll spend a little bit of time on this one to illustrate a couple different points, but pay close attention to how Americans are different and how they are similar in their relationship with nature. And in many ways, that's just good public engagement. It's just good communications. It's good program development, is to recognize the differences. And so let me just step through a few examples here. We found many similarities in Americans' relationship with nature across residential location, race and ethnicity, a political party, geographic region, and so on. Overall, Americans of all types enjoy nature. They like to experience it with others. They have deep affection and attraction toward it, and they support program and funding. But we also found some clear differences, especially in how different groups are concerned about safety, who is present for these activities, and the type of activity that they're interested in. As an example, we asked the question, the intelligence of future generations will suffer if our society becomes more isolated from nature. And you see the disagree and agree broken down here by race and ethnicity. The differences really aren't that large, and from a management or a program management or a communications perspective, probably not a significant difference, although there's some important subtleties there. If you look at that same question by people that self-identified themselves as urban, suburban, or rural, you see even less difference in relation to the question of the future generations. Now moving on to an activity. As an example of a difference, consider taking a walk in the woods. In this question was, it said, how would you rate your interest in? And then there was a long list of questions that people rated their interest. And these are adults. A lot, some, or not at all. And when the option was taking a walk outdoors, you can see the breakdown. Again, not a lot of variation across race and ethnicity. Now let's see that difference by changing the activity to hiking. How would you rate your interest in? Same basic question. The option here is hiking. Walking outdoors versus hiking, it's not much difference to those in the conservation community, but clearly it's a large one in this case based on race and ethnicity. And I'll toggle back. First of all, you see that the none at all interest is pretty small for taking a walk outdoors, and that none at all rises significantly when, again, what many of us would think of as kind of the same thing. Hiking is quite different. So let me take a second here and apply this to, and Tyler's going to go into some more detail on this in her presentation, but just mention a couple of things in relation to the National Wildlife Refuge System branding effort. And we're doing some additional analysis to try and inform this with this really a neat effort that the Fish and Wildlife Service is undertaking right now. But one of the things they've done is identify who their core audience is. They really want to initially figure out how to engage the really active users, the folks that are active, and kind of those innovators. And so that core audience, we looked at the data through the kind of the following sieve to reveal how is that core audience different from the rest of a relatively small proportion, different from the rest of the American Republic, based on in our survey. So we looked at people that had a lot of interest in one or more of the activities you see listed down below, and they'd spent 11 or more hours they spent 11 or more hours outdoors each week, and they strongly agree, I enjoy nature more than anything else. So people that met all three of those criteria, and the activities that one or more, and often that was more than one, were camping, fishing, hiking, hunting, viewing, and taking a walk outdoors. So comparing the people who met that to the rest of the respondents, you see some pretty interesting things. So the average age of the high-end users was 35 versus 44 years old in the whole sample. The household income was about $100,000 compared to $72,000 for the whole sample. Those avid users, 40% Hispanic versus 20% for the sample. And 2/3 were men versus about 1/2 of the sample were men. A couple of other characteristics. 40% were strongly like to be in nature alone. Again, remember, we looked at that 51%. Well, 25% said they like to be in nature alone. But for this group, 40% said they like to be in nature alone. 55% said they have more financial resources to pursue nature interests now than they have in the past. A dramatic difference from, and of course it could be an age relationship there as well as people are increasing income, versus 17% for the overall population. 70% strongly agree there are plenty of places to enjoy nature versus 45% for the general population. And just a couple more. 70% say people that they care about are making more time for nature. Now that probably the biggest gap is there. 70% say they care about, people they care about are making more time for nature. Measure kind of the social aspect and the directionality in terms of more or less time with nature, versus 33% for the overall sample. And finally, 57% strongly agree they are making time to share their interest in nature with children, 57% versus 19% for the general. So clearly, and finally, the 75% strongly agree we need to increase programs to help Americans enjoy nature and wildlife versus 41%. So for many of the kind of the conservation engagement activities, whether it's recreational activities or the importance of nature to them, or supporting funding and programming, this group, relatively small group of people, are quite a bit different than the population overall. And that will have a pretty profound influence on how that branding campaign is developed and rolled out and who it's going to try and focus on. So recommendation number four, just a couple of slides here to finish up. Recommendation number four is to promote multidimensional experiences. Where we talked just now quite a bit about kind of through a recreational lens. But if you look at, again, adults, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statements? Being in nature gives me a sense of peace. Certain smells and sounds of nature bring to mind some of my happiest memories. And being in nature helps give meaning and purpose to my life. So that we so often think of engaging with nature through kind of a recreational lens, or we think of it through an education lens, that we need to educate people, and so through kind of an environmental education lens. But recognizing that a very large proportion of the American public already recognizes and engages with nature and feels that nature in their life is a really, really important thing. And the final recommendation, number five, is to claim a seat at the table. If you just talk about hunting or fishing or wildlife viewing as recreational activities or wildlife management tools, as vitally important as those are to conservation, you don't have the seat. We don't think you have a seat at the table where the big issues are being discussed: healthcare, education, transportation, urban planning. And these are the arenas in which decisions are being made that have large-scale impacts on people, on the landscape, and where those two things intersect. If you want to work to overcome these massive societal problems, if you want to have an influence on far larger than our current budgets or your current budgets, then you'll need to claim a seat at the table. The big question, from our standpoint for the conservation community is how do you build partnerships with the education system and the healthcare system, with community developers and with tourism boards, so that you are expanding your impacts in that promote socially oriented routine contact with nature. I've told this story a number of times, and some of you probably heard it, but it's important and sure important to me. I spoke with Dr. Keller for the last time on November 17th of last year, about 10 days before he passed away. And he was in the hospital, and we jumped back and forth talking about his medical treatment and about the Nature of Americans effort. We were in the process of trying to complete the reports. And toward the end of that conversation, Steve was reflecting on the results of the research and said, we probed more about what it means to be a human being. And we think you're in the business of human flourishing, is a term that Steve had used a number of times. Is that too sweeping of a comment? Perhaps, but Steve Keller didn't think so, and neither do I. More importantly, neither does the American public. Those of us in the conservation community are not just in the business of providing a place for nature to thrive. You're not just in the business of overseeing recreational activities. You're in the business of providing something that's really important to the American public, not just for recreation, but for their health and well-being.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think we'll move on to Tyler's presentation for time's sake, and we'll take more questions at the end. So I've redirected the camera, so we're looking at you now. And just to introduce Tyler, this is Tyler Green. She's a public affairs specialist from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Northeast region. She leads communications and outreach for the service's urban conservation program, and currently she's focusing on applying social science research to outreach and community engagement while in grad school at the University of Pennsylvania. And right now she's dealing with at the HD branch here in Fort Collins. She's been here for 4 weeks now?
This is week 7.
Oh. Time flies.
Not counting him. Thank you. Hi, everyone. There's going to be just a slight overlap a little bit with what Dave spoke about, so I'll try to move quickly to get to some of the more application. But I'm going to talk about 2 things really where this information kind of helps inform and really help guide what the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing. So both of these grew out of a conference that we had several years ago to set a path forward for the refuge system. And, ultimately the Fish and Wildlife Service on how we move forward for the next 10 to 15 years. So 2 recommendations. One is still kind of in its infancy, is our branding effort. Basically, it was a recommendation to create a relevant and a more professional brand. And then the second one is our urban wildlife conservation program. I think for about maybe almost 5 to 6, maybe 7 years now, we've grown that program, and it's really taken off. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the latter portion of my presentation, about how we're applying this, how you can take some of these recommendations and then some examples of what we did on the ground. But I thought first, Dave touched on it, I'll just take a little bit of a deeper dive into how we're starting to apply Redefine Connecting with Nature, and then getting the second recommendation to our branding effort. So I'll just jump right into it. So redefining connecting with nature, kind of like what Dave said, I don't want to rehash it, but this really gets at the perception of how adults versus kids view nature. And so for adults, it's a faraway place. Nature is a destination. Here's one example. I don't think Dave brought this up. I'll just read it to you. In response to, what do you think of when you hear the word nature? The Grand Canyon, nature at its best when I went. It's beautiful. I'd never seen it before, like nature out there by itself. So this is from an older woman. This kind of is a picture of nature as solitary, it's far apart. Conversely, when we hear from kids, nature is nearby and it's local, jumping in puddles, bugs, lightning bugs, ladybugs, things that, most of us probably grew up playing with. I grew up in New York City, so I used to catch lightning bugs. So that's me, that's my nearby nature. And so with the Fish and Wildlife Service, our opportunity here is to play to our strengths. I would say we've done a really good job of marketing that solitude. You can get out there, you can spend time alone, you can find peace. But really what we're trying to focus on now, especially on the people side of things for us, is the Fish and Wildlife Service brand really is nearby nature. We kind of have these like 2 narratives. One is that, come out and visit us, get away, escape from everything. And then this other one now that's been growing, especially with our urban program, is that nature is nearby. It's not a destination. If you go outside, if you walk to the store, that's still experiencing nature. Before I really take a little bit of a deeper dive, I just want to talk a little bit about branding and what it is. So we're going through this process now, so I'm going to see how well I'm applying it. But most of us really see it as a logo, those things that you can identify with the organization or with the company, logos, a website, uniforms. But that's just really part of the story. Your brand is really everything, even the things that are like the logo is the tip of the iceberg. Your brand is really everything. So it's those things that really motivate people, that move them to take action that you want them to do. It's like that cumulative experience about what they have. So for us, we are focusing more on like you can come to a wildlife refuge and take a walk. It's not just this place that you have to pack up a car to and then take a trip. We want people to come out and then just go fishing for a couple of hours and then be able to go back home and cook a meal. We want people to just come out and take a walk for a few miles and then go back to work or go back to class. Additionally, it's a little cheesy, but we're the organization that is responsible for fostering, wildlife conservation, that sense of stewardship. And really, wildlife is all around us. I mean, it's great to think about some of those charismatic species that are probably more out in the West and not more in the more populated areas. But butterflies, those insects, pollinators, there's plenty of wildlife all around us. We want to make sure people are aware of that. When you're walking and some people only see squirrels, that's wildlife too. Seeing butterflies, that's also wildlife. It's just not only about, endangered species. Additionally, we have this idea of connecting with people and that family experience and the tradition that it brings. I'm going to talk more about this application in another recommendation, so I won't spend too much time here. The second one is promoting multidimensional experiences. And this is really just thinking about how it's not one path to engagement. I'm going to focus here on our opportunity, which is multiple story paths. Storytelling is huge, and it's a really big way to connect with people, especially as you're doing marketing and outreach. Those are the things that people remember and they connect with. I'm going to read a passage here about the power of story. Remember this one thing, said Badger. The stories people tell have a way of taking care of them. If stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away where they're needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. That is why we put these stories in each other's memories. This is how people care for themselves. So storytelling is important for our culture. So for what that means for our brand is for us to think about not only creating our own narrative, but tapping into some stories that are part of a broader conversation that's already happening, you know, when it's appropriate. So 4 areas where we're thinking of honing in on our branding process, you know, we're still kind of at the beginning stages, is making memories and passing on tradition, family oriented. When we tell stories and there's a main central character, that's important. Seeking adventure and discovery, just getting outside, doing something epic. This is not so much maybe through a wildlife refuge, but just in nature in general. I just read one of those lists about like most dangerous hikes. That's something to kind of play to for people. That's that sense of discovery and adventure. Find refuge from everyday life. When we start talking about how we can better connect with people, a lot of things come up about that health space, and not only for physical well-being, but for mental well-being and what that means for people. And then lastly, putting food on our tables, especially with the focus on hunting and fishing and sustenance. That's definitely more prevalent in other parts of the country. But there's a lot of folks out there who engage in these activities, put food on the table to provide for themselves. The third thing I'll talk about is being social. And like they said, this is not social media. Won't dive into that. But the opportunity here is fostering a sense of community. Many of us, if we have a care for the outdoors, it's usually because someone introduced it to us. We have fond memories of spending time with people, whether that was going fishing or hunting when we were younger. And those are the things that we want to play to. Representation is important. When we're doing communications and outreach, if you want to connect with that person who's seeking solitude, that backpacker, you're going to use different photographs. If you want to connect with people who are feeling like, I'm afraid to be in nature by myself, you want to make sure that you can show it's a group sport. You can bring someone to spend time with people. I think Dave also touched on this, but people will make time when they have the social support to do so. So when you can spend time with your friends and with your family and they support you doing that, you're going to be more so inclined to take action. Additionally, it also alleviates concern when people are afraid to be outside alone. So just a couple of things here with the service. What we're doing is being cognizant of the language in the photographs that we use. I think knowing your audience. We have a number of what we call urban wildlife refuges, and we're trying to get folks out to come for a walk or do a program or just visit the refuge for the first time. We want to make sure we're focusing on that sense of community with friends, togetherness, and not saying, please come alone and go backpacking, because that's not a first step. That's not a stepping stone to engagement. And then I think in the conservation community, we have done a great job to show that if you want to find solitude, green spaces can provide that, but time in nature does not have to equate with that. We really want folks to know that your local green space is just as important as those places that you might see on postcards. And then I'll talk about this a little bit more, but recruiting groups who are already connected. There are a number of national groups who their main goal is to get people outside who don't spend enough time, and they're already connected. So it's tapping into those groups. It's really no different than how we host school groups or camp groups. Those people are already connected as a unit, and we're just tapping into that and using using that as an opportunity to spread a message. So 4 is claiming a seat at the table. Overall, I really want to drive home. It's not just enough for us to just peddle our message to folks. When we're claiming a seat at the table, it's really just injecting ourselves respectfully into the conversation. So one example here is our wildlife refuge in Philadelphia, our premier, the nation's best. The refuge manager, maybe about 3 years ago, got there, and he's not from Philadelphia. And so just to really figure out how can we, what's the first step? Like, what are we really going to do here? Wanted to kind of flip it a little bit. And instead of thinking like, I'm just going to go ahead and manage the refuge and start doing things, it was first to consult with the community. And that was really just attending community meetings. And when I'm saying insert yourself into the conversation, these community meetings were not about how can we better connect with John Hines National Wildlife Refuge. This was like, we have transportation barriers. We're trying to plan a bike path. We are having safety issues. We need to work out issues with the police. So just going to the meeting and being present, introducing yourself, and just kind of figuring out what are the needs, what are the concerns of that community, and then figuring out where do you fit in, where can you provide that. If there's a low employment rate, one thing that we've been able to do here is start a youth employment program. So there's ways that you can figure out what some of the problems are that a community is facing, especially in these urban areas, and figuring out what role the conservation community plays. Sometimes it's not only going to be about habitat restoration, but it'll be about engaging people in taking stewardship in that work. Just as important is also providing a seat at the table. So in New Haven, Connecticut, we have a Urban Wildlife Refuge Partnership, which is basically a long way to say that it's working with our partners off-site of Fish and Wildlife Service land to create these like patch habitats. So our goal there was to, you may have heard of it, is to create a schoolyard habitat program. And initially we were, approaching different schools, seeing vacant lots and being like, that's a great place to transform, it has so much potential, that'd be a great pollinator garden. But we ran into some issues, mostly because that's not where our expertise was. We're wildlife conservation people. When it comes to community engagement, we have partners who are who have a little bit more credibility in the game, and that's really what we wanted to focus on. So instead of going out and thinking of these grand spaces, we wanted to take a step back. We decided to put together the Community Advisory Council. And what this was made up of teachers, college students, high school students, elected officials, any community member, friends groups, and they came together and were like, here's where you might want to focus your ideas and your energy. Maybe not here because there's some issues and some barriers that we haven't really worked out yet. We've got some safety issues we need to figure out before we can start transforming the green space. So those are 2 examples. And then lastly is considering similarities and differences. I thought one thing that's important to take away from the study, Dave mentioned it, is how much people really support conservation and the work that we do and really value green space. And usually it's the folks that we think don't enjoy it, folks who live in urban areas. But it's actually because they are likely to face, issues more disproportionately than others that they do care about it. And so that support is there. Where we run into some differences is concerns about safety, who's present, and then the type of activity. I don't really want to say it's like a different type of recreation, but there are some folks who are like, I'm going to go outside, I'm going to spend time, and I want to hike 10 miles. And then there's going to be others who, just maybe want to walk a mile and sit on a park bench, or play soccer. And that's good too. So different sectors promote what good connection to nature is, and that varies. So 2 things that we've been doing in Fish and Wildlife Service is partnering with those pre-existing groups. So one is fraternity organization and sororities. Zeta Phi Beta is African American Greek organization. So we partner with them to host these Zeta days on refuges. And it was really to put us out there and say, we want to cater these days to you. Haven't been here before. You're a little nervous about what to expect from a wildlife refuge. Come out and we'll show you. And these were really successful. We held them across the country. This is already a group that is connected together. They're tapped in from ages from like 8 to 60, 70. And some of them had never been to a national wildlife refuge before, introduced to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And now we've got ambassadors and stewards for this entire nationwide organization. The second thing we've done is a youth employment program with the Hispanic Access Foundation. And so, on one hand, it's about diversifying our workforce and also introducing young students who maybe wouldn't have pursued a career in conservation or dream jobs to do so. But also what we do is kind of learn a little bit more about a community that we haven't really done a great job of connecting with. So for the most part, also ambassadors, and a lot of the time these students will work with us and focus on cultivating our urban partnerships in communities where we don't have a presence and where they can provide more insight about things we don't know about. So I think that is it. That's all I got.